in their work. I think, in great part because they read their work, right? They learn that strangeness can be like, emotional, can create like, do rhetorical work on the page. So, it's an incredibly awesome to meet you, kind of face to
Thank you.
face.
Thank you so much. Thank you for saying that. And
Amy, am I correct that I saw your email that you selected one of Todd's pieces for something? So that's kind of cool.
yeah, it was such a fun assignment where it was like they call it, it's like the best shorts, but I can't remember if they call it flash.
It's best small fiction.
Small fictions, that's what they called it. Yes. It's like, the term always changes around. And so it was just like the most fun award ever because there were just all these pieces to read and Todd's was amazing and there were just so many good ones, and then to just gather them together, it was pure pleasure.
That's cool. Very nice. And this was prose or poems?
Prose.
It was flash fiction.
Flash fiction.
Yeah, it's in that line, I guess, where we
Right.
would consider it flash fiction, but you could probably make a case sometimes at least.
Right. Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's all sorts of poets who like kind of cheat, right? They're like, oh, I'm going to write some flash fiction, so they write a prose poem, right?
I mean, yeah, it's like, it's great because then the attention to language is so nice, and yeah.
Very cool.
So, Mark, did you say we do some questions first before we read? Is that what's the format?
Yeah, we'll probably start with like a small conversation, just for like 10 minutes or so, and then you guys will each read for 10 or 15, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. Cool. So I see that most people have, several people have shown up, and so we can go ahead and get started. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. This is our last visiting writers event of our Celebration of Literary Arts, sponsored by Des Moines Area Community College. And we've been doing this for 10 weeks now. So we've had about 20 writers come through our virtual doors to talk to us of all different ilks, right? So we've had different genres, and we've had clearly a special interest in representation and diversity this year, not just in terms of gender and race and ethnicity, but also thinking about style and where people are in their career and age. And so it's been a lot of fun to see the wide range that the writing world can be. And hopefully, if you've been attending every week, that you've gotten like a whole bunch of different kinds of writing that you are hopefully now aware that are out there. So thank you for coming, and we'll just talk about what we'll be doing for the next hour in case you haven't attended before. We'll have a small conversation with our visiting writers. Today we have Amy Bender, who is our fiction writer, short fiction and novelist, and she is joined by W. Todd Kaneko, who also writes prose, but primarily writes poetry. So we'll be talking to them about their different genres and how they manage them. And then they'll each read to us for about 10 or 15 minutes, as you may have heard, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. So this is where you guys come in. We have two tools here in the webinar. In case you aren't aware of the format, we have a chat, and you guys can certainly put information in there. We've had people kind of reinforce lines or things they like about the reading. We've had people ask questions, kind of in place of applause. We have this kind of interactive feature, which has been a lot of fun. We also have a Q&A Dropbox that at anytime during the reading, if you want to drop a question in there, we will try to answer as many as we can in the last 15 minutes. So please do not be shy. Nobody else can see them, the questions you drop, so there's no reason to be nervous. And we'll try to get to all of them as the hour progresses. But first, let me do some introductions, and then we'll get to talking to our visiting writers. So today, we have Amy Bender, who is the author of 6 books: The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, which was a New York Times notable book; An Invisible Sign of My Own, which was an LA Times Pick of the Year; Willful Creatures, which was nominated by The Believer as one of the best books of the year; The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake, which won the SCIBA Award for Best Fiction and an Alex Award; The Color Master, a New York Times notable book for 2013, and her latest novel, The Butterfly Lampshade, which came out in July 2020 and was longlisted for the Penn Gene Stein Award. Her books have been translated into 16 languages. Her short fiction has been published in Granta, GQ, Harper's, Tin House, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, and more, as well as heard on Public Radio International's This American Life and Selected Shorts. And she lives in Los Angeles with her family and teaches creative writing at USC. She's joined by W. Todd Kaneko, who is the author of This Is How the Bone Sings, published in 2020, and The Dead Wrestler's Elegies, which will be re-released as a second edition by New Michigan Press this year. He is co-author of Poetry, a Writer's Guide and Anthology, as well as / winner of the 2020 Diode Editions Chapbook Contest, and will also be published this year. His poems, essays, and stories have been seen in Poetry, Alaskan Quarterly Review, Los Angeles Review, The Normal School, Hobart, Pank, Blackbird, The Rumpus, Bring the Noise, the best of pop culture essays from Barrel House Magazine, the best small fictions 2017 and 2018, and many other journals. A Kundiman Fellow, his work has been nominated for the Best of the Net and the Pushcart Prize, and originally from Seattle, he is currently an associate professor in the writing department at Grand Valley State University, and he lives with his family in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And actually, Caitlin Horrocks, who is your wife, she was the person who appeared first in our reading series this semester. So we get a nice little bookend with the husband-wife pairing. So thank you guys for showing up, and I really appreciate you spending the hour with us.
Thank you for having
Absolutely.
us.
It's an honor to be here.
I didn't know that. You're a talented couple, I will say.
The dynamic duo. I was wondering, actually, thinking about reading your bios and looking at all these publications, about, this is a broad question, so take it for what it is, but we're wondering how you got started in writing. Many of our students are interested in the writing life, but it feels kind of like this foreign world that it's mythical and impossible to imagine being a part of. So we're curious about how you got involved in writing, and maybe who were your influences as you started writing. Amy, do you want to start us off maybe?
Sure. It was kind of a roundabout path for me, though. When I look at it, it doesn't look, in retrospect, it looks sort of clear, but at the time it didn't feel at all clear. And as a kid and a young adult, I read a lot of fairy tales and I loved magical storytelling, though I did feel for a while that I didn't realize there were so many magical storytellers that were for adults, like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or like a Murakami, or like a Kafka even, like there's so many writers, Leonora Carrington, like there're just many, many wonderful voices that I didn't really know about. And so it took me a while to kind of wind my way back to the strangenesses that made sense to me. But I think the thing about writing, or that I found, I often have students come in and they'll just be like, I don't know, I have to do the MFA right now, or I have to do this because otherwise I just worry I'll forget about it or something. And the thing I found about writing is that it just has this quality of lingering, so that even at times when maybe I've wanted to give it a break, it circles back, and it has, and to the point where now it's been a steady part of my life for a long time, and really helps that when I'm writing steadily, even when it's not going well, because I think for me at least, there's something about writing where something comes out on the page that I'm not able to think or speak of. It's the only way it can sort of exit my person is by coming through the typing hands, not even the pen for me. It's just, there's something about the speed of that too. And that feels like a wonderful thing to have as part of my life. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that process, that sort of engagement with something that I can't access otherwise is so important to me at this point.
I love this idea of like the strangeness that makes sense to you, because you tend to write in that vein, magical realism, or kind of mythology kind of writing. And I'm kind of curious about if you could talk a little bit about that style. A lot of our students they love genre fiction, they love the fantasy and sci-fi, but sometimes they feel like they don't have permission to write it, or they kind of feel like they're falling into familiarity when they write in those genres. I'm just kind of curious about how you approach it. How does it inform your work? What can it do that like maybe realism alone can't do? Or I don't know. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
I mean, yeah, I have so many thoughts because it really is important to me. And I think for me, it feels like through the side door comes the emotional place, and that it's not, I can't look at it always so directly and feel the thing off the page. And this is for a reader, listener, watcher as well. Like there's something about a magical twist or a strangeness that gives me an access to feel. And oh, and I had a thought and it just flew out of my head. What was it? Oh, it was in terms of this idea of sci-fi, because sometimes you'll hear in workshops, don't do sci-fi or whatever, which always at this point I think is now being generally viewed as a limited approach, which is good, I think. But that it's all about sentences and language too, that I think the problem can be with any sort of genre is that the student or the writer plugs into just like, cliches. But when we really unpack what is a cliche, it's just something that's been told over and over, so we can't feel it anymore. It has become an overrun, pathway. And so to write sci-fi, fantasy, romance, whatever. I have a student who was really worried about turning in a piece of romance, but it was like, go for romance, just make it yours and use language that feels like it's yours and observations that are from you. And then you can write anything you want because there are, of course, readers of all kinds. And like a story, I just read the last story in Ted Chiang's collection, Exhalation, which is sort of a sci-fi philosophical book of kind of thought experiments. And it's so moving because it's really psychological, but it's about these sort of quantum states of being where we're like getting to confront ourselves that have gone on different choices through a prism. Like it's just a really funky sci-fi story, but he's really probing questions of choice and regret in this really moving way that it's definitely stayed in my mind. And it's such a good example, I think, of the ways you can get to this concept of regret differently and maybe newly through a new kind of story.
Yeah, I love Ted Chiang. That's a great example of how his work navigates the emotion and the cerebral, right?
Yeah, so good.
Very cool. Todd, do you want to tell us a little bit about your beginnings? Like, how did you get started on writing and who your influences are?
Sure. I feel like it's a really long story, so
Sure.
I'll try and cut to the gist. I came to writing pretty late. I was in my mid-30s when I went back to school. I was probably like about 30 when I went back to school to get my BA in English, and then I didn't really I didn't know I was going to start writing until I was probably in my mid-30s. Did I lock up? Oh, no, there I am. Good. Sorry, I've had some Zoom problems recently. So when people are too still, I'm like, oh no, I've lost my connection. I did a thing the other day where like, someone had their kid running around in the background. As long as I saw the kid moving, I knew that I was good. I started writing probably when I was about 35, so I feel like I came really late compared to, everyone who's coming in MFA programs in their 20s now. My dad was a writer, so I felt like I felt like I didn't want to join the family business. So I did other things. Eventually found my way into writing. I entered an MFA program, got my MFA in fiction, wrote a lot of stories, wrote a lot of stuff, graduated, got my degree, got out into the world and realized that I didn't have time to get into a story. For me, I'm a dreamer. I get into a story and I'm lost there until I get out, and it was so much trouble to get into a story and get out of a story. I felt like I might lose my job. So I had to figure out how do I, satisfy the writing bug. And the answer was poems. I had no idea how to write poems. Line breaks scared me. I didn't know how they work. Poems were just these alien things until I was asked to teach this, course about writing poetry. I was like, I don't know. So I had to teach myself. The MFA prepared me by showing me how to read, showing me how to actually read and think like a writer. And once I got that in my head, like writing is a habit of mind. Once I figured that out, man, I could read anything and start to learn stuff from it. So yeah, I started teaching myself how to write poems probably about 2007. I know it's 2007 because that's when I got assigned that class. And then, from there, it's just been me, reading poetry, reading all I can. in order to figure out, how do I write poems? Because I don't have that, that poetry mentor to turn to and say, hey, how do I do this? My poetry mentor weirdly is Kim Addonizio. I've never met her, but her book, What Is This Thing Called Love? I was like, I read that book and suddenly I understood stuff, right? I understood. I thought, oh, I see why she's doing that line break. So I read everything that she wrote, right? Naomi Shihab Nye is another poet. I read her book Fuel and I understood it, not in terms of meaning, but in terms of mechanics. How does the poem work? Lee Young Lee, same way. These poets, I think, or fiction writers or whoever you're reading, when you start to understand what they're doing, kind of what's happening is they're speaking to you. They're saying, hey, you read this story, you learned something, maybe read a little more. What else you can learn, and so my poetry mentors end up being just like almost everybody that I read. I learn from so many people,
Cool.
and just how I operate now.
I was thinking about your voice too, and thinking about Amy talking about the strangeness that speaks to her, and your poems tend to take on persona. You write often in like the guise of, well, Dead Wrestler Elegies, which is being re-released this year. Thinking about most of the poems written from the point of view of or around this idea of professional wrestlers. And you have a handful of like heavy metal poems and pop culture persona poems. I'm kind of curious about how you adopted that style, and how do you approach, let's say, persona, for instance, or humor in your own writing?
I think the short answer is I love wrestling. The long answer is sort of like, Amy talked about the power of fairy tales and fables. Those stories, those old stories tell us who we are, and they tell us how to act. They tell us, who we are as a society and as individuals in that society. In great part, a lot of them are such cautionary tales. I look at, what we call pop culture as that's our mythology now. Those are the stories that we tell to explain to each other who we are, right? And it feels weird to say that, something like Kesha's TikTok or Breaking Bad or WrestleMania is like has that sort of relevance, but I really do think it does. And it's just a relative importance, right? If you don't watch wrestling, maybe you don't get as much sort of satisfaction or understand as much of the magic there. But Athena was powerful in Athens. That's it, right? You go to Sparta, good luck. And still, we're writing poems about Athena, right? We're still writing poems about all those gods whose power was so relative. I guess I see writing about pop culture, writing about pop culture is you're writing about things that other people want you to dismiss. When people say don't write about pop culture, often they're being classist. Sometimes they're being racist. They're telling you that only certain things are worth writing about, and your experiences and the things that you hold dear are not important. And I rail against that. So I guess that's where I'm at. It's me sort of interacting with the stories that I see us telling each other about who we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've been reading your poems in our classes, and it's been speaking to our students in a very accessible way, which they're not used to with poetry. They think it's this thing that's for others, and it really makes it for them. Well, maybe we can hear some of your guys' words, and you can read to us for a little bit for 10 or 15 a piece. Amy, would you like to maybe start us off and share some of your work with us?
Yeah, gladly. And Todd, I love what you said. And I just want to say that I always feel like when people talk about this elusive thing called voice, like the way to voice is to acknowledge and embrace these things that actually are important to you. So whether that's pop culture or for me, fairy tales, like to actually lean into that was so freeing for me. And that all of us are kind of imbibing all kinds of different art all the time and all these different media, and that the mishmash that is inside each one of us becomes a kind of way to access voice. But that, yeah, to have to cut out any of those things, then the work dries up. Like, I think it does lose some spark. All right, I just felt compelled to say that because I really liked your point. I'm going to read, so I have this new novel and I'm just going to read a short chapter. It's probably under 10 minutes, but I feel like it's sort of the central project of the book where the character is trying to think about looking back at a certain moment in her life when her mom had a psychotic episode and she had to leave home and move in with her aunt and uncle. And it's just a moment of realizing that something deserves a deeper look, and what are those moments that maybe are fleeting and fleeting and fleeting and then become central. It's chapter 8. The main character is now in her around 26, thinking about a time when she was 8. I think of this now from the balcony of my apartment in the depths of the San Fernando Valley, where I live on the 3rd floor of a sand-colored stucco building about a 10-minute bus ride from my aunt and uncle's home. I have lived here in this particular apartment for 3 years and have stayed in Los Angeles for nearly 20. One afternoon many months ago, on a day of nothing notable except a certain familiar emptiness rolling out at its edges inside me, after walking home at dusk from my managerial job at the framing store down the street, which I had taken because it was maybe of interest to me, business, although I disliked the place and the hours and the act of constant framing, I settled on the balcony eating a bag of potato chips, gazing at a couple of leafy orange trees, remnants of a bygone grove. For whatever reason, something was unusually quiet inside me that day looking out, as if some new space had opened up for a moment, like a rotating door revealing its slim aperture of access to the outside. And through this opening, an image had slid into my head, steady and true, of what it had been like on the playground in Portland at Lewis and Clark Elementary those many years ago. There I was, 8 years old, standing by myself in the middle of the playground, totally still with the windy air, the diamond patterned fence, the melting cracker taste in my mouth, tracking. How the other kids running around thought I was still frozen from some long past game of tag and on the way back to class had swatted my shoulder to unfreeze me. From the balcony, I could see someone walk out of a store and someone walk into a store and cars pulling away from the metered curb and new cars gliding into place. My apartment was near the corner, so my scope of view included pedestrians stepping into their cars on Chandler and a glimpse of Victory Boulevard and all the commercial activity there. It was a cloudy afternoon in July, and the blasting heat of summer had not yet fully baked the valley into brown, so the hill still showed swaths of rolling green patched with bands of blazing yellow. I ate my bag of potato chips and sat next to the small succulent plant in its terracotta pot left behind by a previous tenant, and for a moment felt myself living inside both times at once. Why had the memory risen up right then? I did not know. It was overall a scattered time in my life. I was 26 years old. I went to my framing job nearly every day and stood behind the counter and took orders and offered opinions on metal versus wood. I filled up my Friday and Saturday nights with activities initiated by others. I attended a few dinners in which I and another person eyed each other as potential mates after a recent breakup with a fellow whom my aunt and Vicky had asked about almost constantly with delighted winks in their voices. But other than my continued weekend outings to yard sales to hunt for items to sell online, it all felt like further performances of participation, just as I had experienced in the 3rd grade classroom, sitting at a table and talking and joking with the other students as if I were there. I inhabited none of it. And the sensation I was recalling right then on the balcony, the memory of standing still and paying attention until that hand arrived on my shoulder of the girl calling, "Francie's frozen again," and all the kids laughing. This memory evoked something different, something else, like catching a whiff of a fragrant long ago scent from a far off and regal country. I hadn't even minded being teased about standing so still like a lump. It had been sweet, the teasing. It had never stopped me. On the balcony, a breeze blew over my face and cars stopped at the red light and then moved forward at the green light. And the memory of the playground began to slip, the hand releasing my shoulder, freeze tag over, body disappearing into time. Then I went inside and threw out the potato chip bag, made some plans for the weekend, and forgot again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's from Amy's newest novel, The Butterfly Lampshade. And before we get to Todd, I was going to ask you, Amy, a little bit about the novel, and not just this particular novel, but like the novel, and like how you approach writing a novel versus a short story, what the process is like, maybe even thinking about this book. How do you know when you have a novel on your hands versus a short story? I don't know. A lot of my students had questions about like, how do you differentiate? And so do you want to speak to that for a few minutes for us?
Sure, absolutely. And I think, obviously it's different for each writer, but my whole writing process has been about setting aside a certain block of time each day that has worked for me to have the only thing that's intended is the amount of time that I'm going to sit there. I don't have to write. I just have the amount of time is the only intention, and that whatever work comes up is what comes up. And certain things drive towards an ending, or I feel like I can kind of feel that there's a little bit more to say, and certain things keep opening up. And for example, this book, like I felt very drawn to the words aunt and uncle more so than mother and father. And that was kind of a clue for me to begin to write scenes. And the scenes for me then started to kind of accrue and gather. And then I could start to see that there were characters that I had more to say about than would fit in the length of a short story. Whereas a short story, sometimes it'll start and it's like a train or something where it just like pushes forward. And I can just feel that the thing is narrowing, hopefully short stories and meaning expand, but like the push of the story is narrowing. And in a novel, it's sort of this opposite feeling of just like, oh, there's more to say. Oh, I don't understand this, or why is it aunt and uncle, or these questions upon questions. And so they do feel like really different processes for me, but it's very mood related when I sit down in the morning, like, what am I going to work on? I've sort of grown to trust that if I'm working regularly, I can really pick on any given day what I feel like, and something will get done. But I don't know what, and I don't know which is the thing that will work, but some work will get done.
So just a quick question before we move to Todd. I was like, the expansiveness in your novel writing, and it's gathering, and it just keeps getting, well, a little like messier. How do you know when it's like, how do you start ending it? Like, how do you close the novel when it just keeps expanding?
Yeah, well, it was like the preoccupations start to become clearer. So it's like there's a lot of parts that you can start to feel are at the edges because they don't relate anymore. Like, oh, this character, no, I don't want to write about them anymore, or even this place or this action. And the central things that start to feel like I'm repeatedly interested in. And then I guess there's a certain point of like printing out a bunch of pages, laying them on the floor, and starting to even look and see like what scene might come after what is the consequence of this. Once in my first novel, I realized two characters I'd been writing about were the same guy. And it was like that suddenly created shape in the novel that I hadn't had. It was such a great moment because it was like, it felt really messy. And then I was like, oh, if they're the same guy, then suddenly all these scenes tighten. And it felt like there was like an arc. So, I mean, I guess I have a pretty good tolerance in my home and on the files with mess, because there's a lot, I just say, as you can see, this is all really here to just cover up a lot of mess. But so like just to make the mess, and then to, at a certain point, kind of trust that the mess has a shape. It's just like the more mess I can make, the more likely the shape will become clearer quicker.
Gotcha. That's great advice. Thank you so much. Todd, would you like to share some of your work with us, please?
I'd be glad to. So I kind of selected some poems. Mark sent us these questions about persona and pop culture. Sent me these, persona and pop culture, which it's kind of not what I usually read, but I'm gonna read some of it anyways. And I'm trying to figure out what from the, I've been reading from my new book. This is How the Bone Sings. I have a few poems I think I can read from there that kind of play with that idea. The book, This Is How the Bone Sings, it's a book of poems about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. My dad and my grandparents lived at Minidoka, a concentration camp in Idaho, and for the duration of the war. My dad was probably 3 or 4, and he remembers it very vaguely. My grandparents suffered a lot during that time. So the book is about that, and how, it's not my story, but it's my history, and it's my son's history now too. So there's some poems in the book where I try to reimagine my grandparents being in love in the concentration camp. And my grandfather's the ogre, and my grandmother's the witch. So I'll read you a couple of these hypothetical, kind of speculative love poems between my grandparents. This is the ogre's love song. We can be anything. You, the huntress, arrows knocked for game. Me, the woodsman, keeping the coyotes at bay. I will carve you a garden from the brambles, a home out of those darkest hearts of wood. And you can sing to bluebirds, not cobwebs, to a cluster of stars instead of the gloomy pallor of dusk. At night, while porcupines sharpen their bodies against our walls, the elk, their antlers at our door, you can be a bright song, and I will become anything to protect us from those fiendish shapes carved for us from the dark. I'll hew an orchard out of the night. We just have to survive the trees. And here's a reply. This is the witch's love song. I'm not like those pale women hunted down and drowned by men who believed too stout in the devil's tongue, not like those crones set ablaze, mistaken for slaves to their own carnivorous desires. One day we'll be together in an orchard near the sea, far from that skeleton of home we left in the wasteland. I'm not a bird shaped like a woman, not a woman wielding fire or broom. And you were never an ogre, but a man, his insides displaced by wasps and the brief sounds of animals in quicksand. One day we'll be together again. In that brand new house you will sculpt out of pine trees and wishbones. Or I will conjure us a house out of those new words the spider has invented for love. We'll be together again once this body has released its secret syllables. I can be a woman, you a man. We'll be safe there. So those poems, like there's a number of poems in the book that go back and forth between the ogre and the witch. And we were thinking about why we use persona and why we use these other stories. Poems, they say, I say they say because it's said by poet or critic whose name I can't remember right now. That poems tell us the things that we can't actually say, and I think that's something that happens in our work. I have some poems I'm going to read you from, I think, which I hope is going to be a future book. My dad passed away in 2017. And it was right in the middle of, right before, April. He passed on March 30th. I flew out to Seattle on the 31st. And then it was April 1st. And I had already committed to writing a poem a day with my friends. And so I wrote 30 grief-filled poems for my dad. And why do we write about pop culture? Why do we write about these other stories? Because sometimes we do it to survive. Elegy. My dad was friends with Bruce Lee when he was in college, and all you got to know about Bruce is that he's a kung fu master, and he was a national cha-cha champion. Elegy for Bruce Lee. Somewhere in the dark sky is a beautiful fight. 1, 2. Cha-cha-cha, all our knuckles rapping against the stars' edges for the dancing master, for a flying sidekick to our body centers. My father called you Little Dragon Lee, told me how you swiveled your hips across the floor. 3, 4, cha-cha-cha. Then you both wrote love poems for a girl in your English class. I practiced throwing roundhouse kicks as a boy, feet aimed at my reflection in store windows, at street signs, at parked cars, everything I knew I could break. Now my feet cannot leave the ground, and I write love poems for the dead. The last time I watched Enter the Dragon, I imagined it was my father emerging victorious from the Hall of Mirrors, my father hustling on the dance floor, because the last time I saw my father, he'd been waiting for me the whole day in the morgue. Hold me, he said. And I did, until his body stopped acting like it was alive. There's no fight where there's no spark. No wretched cockcrow in the dark, just this cha-cha-cha. Grief is a fist and a promise to hurt someone. Just give it an inch between knuckle and breastbone. It'll punch through everyone. The best Star Trek movie was The Search for Spock. Elegy for Mr. Spock. The first time you died, your friends searched the universe to bring you home because it's easy to abandon logic for grief. My father died a year ago, and I'm still writing poems to bring him back to me. The son of a man from outer space, the alien child of an Earth woman. Nothing makes complete sense. On television, the phasers are set for stun because there's no such thing as death for major characters. While on Earth, we offer our last goodbye to the dead just once. And then we say it again every day for the rest of our lives. Say goodbye to moving images in mirrors, in store windows, to the sky at night, to hope for a glimpse of life out there in the stars. Maybe my father's there hovering outside the window, hands held up in a weird salute for a prosperous future, because we search the universe for our dead still, though we know it's illogical, though we know we're alone. This is a Spider-Man poem. Elegy with great responsibility. So, you wish you could be a hero. Desire to crawl along the edges of skyscrapers, somersault into the world wearing a brave new skin. Your father hasn't taught you to fight, hasn't bequeathed you hood nor mantle, but the kind of grief that changes a boy, turns his guts to stale air and twine. You look at death some nights, stroke its cheek with your palm, and know how different the world could be if you were a spider. You could spin a line from the end of your bed to the moon, climb through the sky and sling your body to where your father's body sleeps with your name sewn to the insides of his eyelids, the way you have his name stitched in cobwebs across your chest, the way the spider repairs its web every morning to cover the ravages of night. You're a man, powerless at the end of your father's life. And with great powerlessness comes grief, cloying and threaded through your bones, a tether to darkness. It's hard to promise to do better next time when time has expired. Harder to live in the world after failing to take care of the dead. I'm going to read two more poems. And you know, I haven't been reading Dead Wrestler poems recently, but that second edition is coming out, and Mark brought it up. So that second edition is going to have some new poems in it. So these are some new poems that are in this second edition. So I'll read two poems here. I was going to read these earlier. That's okay. Matt Bourne was a guy who wrestled in a fright wig. He wrestled as a clown. They called him Doink the Clown. And he died in 2013 of a drug overdose. In a famous interview, Matt Bourne says to the camera, "I can clown around, I can still kick your ass." Doink the Clown clowns around. A man walks into a bar because it's funny. And a man isn't a clown just because he dresses like one. Tonight, I wear fear like a uniform, fright wig, lipstick, a goon's complexion for a childhood gone cockeyed. A man walks into a bar, sucker punches you, then sits on your stomach and recites dirty knock-knock jokes until closing time. It doesn't matter who's there. The punchline is always the same: a face full of seltzer and a floppy shoe across the bridge of your nose. It's funny how the difference between a man and a clown comes down to the color of his nose and the size of his squeeze horn. A man walks into a bar. He buys you a drink and follows you back to your apartment. In the morning, he's harvested your kidneys and your cat is pregnant. A man dressed like a clown, still a man. When the man collapses, the clown is all that remains. Surprise. It's not funny. I'll close with this one. Thanks, Mark, for inviting me to this this awesome event, and thank you to Amy Bender for being Amy Bender and being here. It's an honor to everyone, and thank you all for being here too. Bobo Brazil was a wrestler from in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. He was the very first Black world heavyweight champion in pro wrestling, but he's not recognized as champion because in the storyline he gave up the champion because he says, Buddy Rogers was injured, and I don't want to win the championship from an injured man. I want to get him at his best. So first Black champion, but they weren't brave enough to actually make him champion. In a famous promo, he says, do you know where I'm come from? I come from a little small town by the name of Benton Harbor, Michigan. You know what street I live on? I live on Tough Street. Do you know where I live? At the very bottom of that street. But I don't go around bragging about how tough I am. Bobo Brazil died in 2013 of a stroke. Where Bobo Brazil lives. You can learn a lot about a man by knowing where he comes from. A town where bowfins once prowled for crayfish, ospreys preening in the weeds. Here's a washing machine, an old tractor, boarded up strip malls and factories spread out on a 4-mile grid. Where I come from, a man knows the color of his skin like he carries the weight of his knuckles, the velocity of temper. Boys strike lightning to build a fire, and girls spark cigarettes to life. I bloom red in the dark, then exhale smoke to cloak all our worries about where anyone lives. You can learn a lot about a town by the contours of a man's body. Cauliflower ear, split lip, bruised tailbone, fists all raised towards heaven. We know the street fights and flowers, heartbreak and kidney punch. Then a man crying on the lawn, surrounded by police radio chatter. Everyone needs someone to root for, someone to lift them up. Everyone knows how tough we are in this neighborhood. And beautiful. Now that's something to brag about. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's so great. We have a question in the Q&A actually. And I was thinking about this listening to Todd's work. The question is thinking about are there poems where you prioritize the feeling over structure, as in you're dealing with like a certain genre that probably maybe comes with a certain amount of tropes or rules, and maybe craft can get in the way of emotion. Whereas I always find your poems, even though if you're writing in the guise of a wrestler, there's always like an emotional turn that you make, and maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I think with poems, it's weird. I don't think that craft ever gets my way, because if I'm a bundle of emotion, craft is what gives me shape. Craft, if I'm all boneless and you know, in a lump because I'm emotional, right? A stanza gives me something to lean on. A couplet gives me something to do on the page. Like Amy, she says, she's going to make a mess and see what happens. That's kind of how it is. If I know what a poem is about before I walk in, it's not as interesting as if I just have an image or an idea, walk into the poem, and then I've got to do something. And what do? Well, I do things that poems do. I use an image, I make a metaphor. For me, it never gets in the way. It helps me sharpen and clarify what it is I'm feeling. And when I'm lucky, it actually helps me understand what I'm feeling and discover new things about what I'm feeling. So for me, the idea of craft is it's a tool for me to solidify and sharpen and help make clear the emotional content of a poem, so that I can hopefully actually deliver that to the reader, and the reader can experience something similar.
That's great. Amy, do you have a similar experience? Novels in particular, but short stories too, they're highly structured. You just talked about it a little while ago. And is there ever moments where you're so involved in the structure and craft and point of view and plot that, how do you balance that with, the raw emotion that we're all trying to go for?
Yeah, I mean, and for Todd, it was so great to hear you. And I loved the variety that you read. And there's something about grief as cloying and tethered. It was just a really beautiful image, so many of them. So it's really, really a pleasure. And yeah, I mean, I think it's like language is a structure already, right? So emotion, I think often of this line in Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, where he talks about musicians and jazz, and he writes about jazz sort of better than I've ever read anyone writing about music. And he talks about a roar coming up from the void, and the musician imposing order on it, and how this experience we have as people, where there's this kind of internal roar, these things that are passing through us that are shapeless, and that the role of the artist, because I feel like Baldwin is talking about musicians, but as a writer, he must also be talking about writing, that the words give you a way to kind of wrangle with this shapelessness inside. And so, yeah, like I really am a big fan of the writing exercise, because it feels like you give a student a structure, or I give myself a structure, and the structure can be as simple as me throwing to everyone here, eggplant, please write a paragraph and put eggplant in it and end it end it in a word that ends with the T. You know what I mean? Like, it can be that inane, and then everyone gets to work and the brain does something with that, and there's still an emotional piece that gets to be funneled through, but you get surprised because the structure is outside of yourself. So I think with novels and with short stories too, for me, it's so much about just like, what if I can follow a sentence that has a vibrancy to it, then that will lead me somewhere. And most of the sentences that I write are really dead. So it's like I'm writing dead, 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 dead. And then like something has a spark, and what a relief. And then I'll follow that one. And then the structure of things like point of view, things like craft in all its ways become tools that you use to shape this thing, the same way that the musician uses the instrument.
That's great. We had a follow-up question actually in the Q&A, thinking about novels, and it says, there's an impression that an aspiring writer, you have to start off with short stories, and if you're successful with that, then you get to take off on a novel. Is there anyone who starts writing novels and moves to other things later? When do you first want to write a novel, and when do you feel you're ready? So I guess we're thinking progression of genre, or are there no rules? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, recently, Percival Everett, a colleague of mine and a wonderful writer, was saying, like, right, there's this sort of false notion that you graduate to a novel, but it's just not true, because the short story is an art form unto itself. It's not like you graduate to a longer thing. I think some writers take up space and they're natural novelists. And for a while, I felt like short stories were really a good fit for me, because I couldn't imagine writing anything longer than 10 pages. And then suddenly it did start to get bigger. But I think, yeah, that if I think of someone like Alice Munro, she wrote a novel, and then it was clear that it wasn't her thing, and she went back to doing the brilliant short stories she does. Or someone like Amy Hempel, who only does these beautiful, intense short stories. So yeah, and that these writers are incredible. It's just marketplace is the only driving thing around that notion about novels, because more people read novels because they like to kind of hang out with the characters for longer. But in a short story, you just read it again, and that's how you hang out with the characters for longer. Anyway, I have clearly many opinions about this.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned Alice Munro, whose short stories are very novelistic. They're like long and thorough and very expansive, so. See, another question we have from the Q&A is also thinking about genre, and maybe this would be a good one for Todd, who writes in several genres. You write fiction, got your MFA in fiction, and you write poetry. It's like, what is a genre or form that intimidates you, but that you want to practice? Is there a genre out there that you're like, how do they do that? Or are you not intimidated?
I'm intimidated by everything. I think that, I've written poems, but the next poem, I'm like, oh gosh, where does it come from? I write stories too, but like same thing. It's like, I know how to make a plot. It doesn't make making plots any easier, I know how to write a flash, but I don't want to write the same flash over and over again. I think that, yeah, that's my answer. It's all scary. It's all intimidating. And I think the day that it's not intimidating, I might be done writing, because that's the, it's the excitement. I'm going to go do my thing, and I don't know what I'm going to do, yeah, it's, if I'm not intimidated, maybe I'm not doing anything, brave, or I'm not doing anything maybe worth doing. And maybe I should just go watch TV and eat a sandwich or something.
So maybe this will move to the question of process. Todd, what is the process, your writing process like, even on the most practical level, or maybe on a more artistic level? I know you have young children, and we have several students who are also juggling facets of their life. How do you kind of, balance all those things, find time for writing? Do you have some words of advice?
I'm the wrong person to ask right now. Um, when my son was born 5 years ago, right? I was like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna get writing done? And I learned how to steal time away from my job, away from parenting, away from being a good person. Right? I'd just steal time where I could, and I'd write during those times, right? And so a lot of those times were like I wrote so many poems at the foot of his bed while he was asleep. So then he woke up, I could put my hand on his chest, he'd go back to sleep, and I don't have to soothe him back to sleep, right? That was just me stealing time. I have 7-month-old twins now, and now, and we're in a pandemic, and we don't have a lot of help with childcare, and and I'm teaching online, so like now I'm just trying to steal time to do my job and to be a dad, and I haven't quite figured out how do I steal time to write. That's kind of a lie, actually. I started writing lyric essays on my phone, like lyric essays where I'm just saying there's no research in this essay. Everything, I'm either going to make it up or I'm going to do it from memory. And that's because I'm on my phone and I can't like research because I have a baby on top of me sleeping. So I guess that's where I'm at now. All the writing that I do now happens in the notes on my phone. Fortunately, I write poems, so they're a little shorter. But that's really also like, I'm thinking about the form. If I'm going to write something longer form, it's going to be in short bursts. It's going to be in these small sections that I can write on my phone and not get lost. And then hopefully, when the world opens back up and my kids get a little older, I'll be back to stealing time from all the normal places.
Yes, I know we were trying to get you and your wife to read at the same reading, and she was like, that's going to be impossible because they have kids. And so luckily it worked out this way, but that's very, very cool. And Amy, you also, we were talking before the reading, also have twins who are a little older, but the same challenges, not just with parental care, but just as a writer. What's the process that you follow?
I love this idea of stealing time for being a good person. Funny. That's its own poem. Like, what are those moments, right? Yeah, well, I just, I hear you on the twins thing and twins in a pandemic. It's like both helpful to be home all the time if you're able to be home, but and look, we have also someone here. Your old twin boys, Sierra. Yep. It's like I have 7-year-old twins now, so but I remember there was a point when the one middle of the day nap split into 2 naps. And it was like the first nap I would fall asleep and then do some stuff. And then the second nap, and I had like various teaching things to do, but I had like a little time and I started to do 10-minute blocks of writing. And like the novel that I wrote began with those 10-minute blocks. So it was only 10 minutes. I was bleary. It was within other things, but I think it's true that you can always kind of find 10 minutes. I mean, based on how much ridiculous time I spend looking at Twitter, like it would be so, like this 10-minute block, which for me was just keeping a foot in the writing life, did end up having some fruit, but it's repeated again with the pandemic because I've been home with my kids and I've been trying to wake up early and fit in 10 minutes and I'm not writing a lot. Like it's definitely taken a huge hit. But for me, it's helpful to have something steady, even if it's really small and really bad. Like it just feels like that way. I feel like some process, some sort of imaginative unconscious process is at work and something eventually will be of interest. But I think I sometimes think of like time as this fabric, right? Where it's like, it feels like there's no time and yet what is a tiny space to even look out a window without doing a task? What does a writer need? A writer also needs a little bit of space looking out of windows. And so even for a writer who has no time to write, to just be like, I'm going to just tune everyone out for 1 minute and look out the window and be with my own mind. That is even cultivating a kind of writership in the world. It's hard. I mean, I'm not looking out a lot of windows, but
I love that. And you're not writing poems, but even in the like where like you can maybe do short bursts, as Todd is suggesting. But I noticed that in your novel, um, they're very short chapters. They're like short bursts. Is that mirroring like your writing process, or is it just an intentional craft element?
No, it's 100% mirroring that. I would go in and I would write something really short, and some of those things I liked and became parts of the book. And there are other chapters that are longer, and it's like I could probably label that chapter like the children went to kindergarten. Like I had a more longer attention span and could spend longer with this chapter. But then I liked the short ones too. Like I liked the very variable feel. But yeah, directly related.
Yeah, well, and it works in terms of like form matching content because you're dealing with somebody who has like fractured memory and it jumps all over the place, which is really what the book is kind of headed towards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking about your latest book, Todd, you mentioned it obviously, and you said it better than I could. This is How the Bone Sings in terms of your like generational history of the internment camps, Japanese internment camps during World War II. I loved what you were saying about how you write in terms of myth because we have to. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. I like this. Are you saying that like you need that distance in terms of mythology to get permission or have an emotional, we're again kind of rely on craft or storytelling as opposed to hitting it directly?
Yeah. So yes. It's not, I thought a lot about this, sort of how, the internment camps story is not my story. It's not my lived experience. And so, I've grappled a lot with how do I talk about this thing that I didn't live through, right? Moreover, among a lot of Japanese American families, camp is just not something you talk about. It's a very shameful part of the life. This thing happened. It's awful. We don't want to remember it. We don't want to think about it. Plus, there's sort of a guilt. Like, why did we just go? Why didn't, this is pre-civil rights, right? So no one, when the government came and told you to do something, you did it. So there's a lot of reasons why people didn't talk about it. And so, how I was trying to figure out, well, how do I fill that silence? The silence that is there because there has been no conversation, so a lot of the, when I'm using the ogres and the witches and other things to talk about camp, I mean, that's just something that poems do, right? That's how you make metaphors. You talk about something by talking about something else, but also like, it's like, that's what we do when we have things to say, but we don't want to talk about them, right? Think about the last time you had to confess a secret to someone, just confess something you did wrong. You're like, well, I got to tell you something. Oh yeah, what? Well, sure's a nice day out, isn't it? Let's, right, you change the subject and go elsewhere, right? In order to figure out how to get around to the directness, if you ever get there at all. So yeah, it was both. It's all of that. One, it's to fill the silence that isn't my story, to get permission, but it's also craft. It's poems don't owe anything to facts. They owe everything to the truth, I think, and thank goodness, because I don't have the facts. I only have what I heard second or third hand, which is hearsay.
Right. Yeah, and it's like interesting pivot where older generation experience this, and you're often talking about your own son and what do you tell him, and we're kind of in this in-between place as translator. I love that idea. We're almost out of time, but we tend to end with a single question in terms of advice, and we were curious about if you could go back and give advice to your younger self about writing or the writing life or anything really. Well, obviously, what advice would you give to our students? But what would you have told your previous self in terms of advice? Amy, do you have some thoughts, like some words of wisdom that you'd impart to our young writers here?
Yeah, I guess I spent a lot of time worrying about what was to come and what what should I do, and like making decisions before I was ready to make decisions. And I guess I had that in my life, and I also had it on the page, in that sort of making a sort of plot move before it was felt. And I guess I would just say, like, if you keep living your life and you keep following your interests and you keep trying to deepen who you are in whatever way you can, then you grow and things change. And that I wish I just hadn't spent so much time sort of imagining I would not grow, like just thinking that I had to force it, or thinking I had to sort of make choices falsely. It was just like so much time spent worrying about that was not needed at all. And that worry did nothing except create static. Like it did absolutely zero. So many
Right.
times I thought like I could think my way into an answer, and all I did was stress myself out.
Right. It's distracting from the creation. Yeah.
Exactly. So distracted.
Todd, do you have some advice that you could impart to us, or that you would impart to yourself, if you could?
Save your money. I feel like, I came to writing pretty late, and I'm okay with that. I did stuff. Amy said you're gonna live your life. Absolutely, live your life. And it's writing isn't about what you accomplish. I've been super lucky. I have a couple books. I've had a couple journals say that I published my work. That's not everybody's experience. It's not most people's experience, and I fully acknowledge what a privilege I have in doing that, and how lucky I've been. But you can't look at other people and see what they've done. You can only do what you're going to do, right? So I guess my advice is put your head down, and do your work, and do the work that you love, and do the work that you want to do. And that's what's important. And everything else, that's separate, right? Be an artist. Don't worry about being a business person until you have to be, right? Because honestly, being a business person, I mean, once you start publishing it, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time that you could be spent, writing, where instead you're like sending a bio, or sending a photo, or filling out some W-9 for some other state, or, there's just a lot of busy work. Maybe my real advice is to get a personal assistant so that they can do that crap for you. But really, just write what you're going to write. Don't, when someone says, hey, you can't write sci-fi. Well, yeah, you can. Don't listen to them, right? When someone says you can't write about, pro wrestling, don't listen to them. Write about what you want to write, and you'll make it yours.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. So many young writers, or all writers, are much more interested in like, how do I get the book out, as opposed to like writing the book. And so I love your advice about putting your head down. Well, we're out of time, but I just want to thank you guys so much for spending the hour with us. We have so many questions in the Q&A in the chat that we didn't even hit upon, because people are so interested in what you're saying. So I really appreciate that. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And so for those of you who are here, just a couple things to mention is that we have these recordings of these readings online, and I should probably put these in the chat so you have access to them. And this one will be up in a few minutes, of course. Next week, we have student reading. So we'll close actually our semester with DMAC students reading from their work. And if you could hold on a minute for the audience members, we have, speaking of personal assistants and some busy work, we have an online survey that everybody should take because our college requires it. And so for accreditation and all that stuff. So if you have time, if you have 30 seconds, go ahead and click that link and give us some feedback on our series this semester. But once again, I just want to thank you guys for showing and up and sharing your words. And I know that everybody really appreciates it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Mark.
All right. See you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone, thank you.
Absolutely.